This promises to be a very intellectually stimulating panel, no pun intended, and we have an amazing lineup of panelists today. But I'm just going to introduce our awesome moderator. We have Alyssa Welly here today. She is a freelance journalist, freelance science journalist, and it's very exciting because unlike a lot of journalists I meet who start learning about a field, she got a PhD in neurotechnology, then decided to go be a journalist. And so she's fairly qualified to moderate this panel. What's also fun about her is that she is the ultimate survivalist. She was out in the wilderness for 7 days in the Colorado mountains with her dog. And most fun fact, she's getting married in May. With that, I'll turn it over to Alyssa.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody, we're excited to be here. I'm really excited to moderate this panel. Thank you all for coming. We've got really amazing experts here today. And the best part about this panel is that we're going to talk about this awesome field of neurotechnology in the context of AI from kind of two big perspectives, both from the research perspective and also from the commercial perspective. We've got here two people from Synchron. Got Peter Yu and Tom Oxley here. Tom is the CEO of Synchron, and Peter is the scientific director of neuroscience and algorithms. And then we also have from the research side, we have Miriam Cernacci from University of Southern California, where she is the professor and chair of electrical and computer engineering, as well as a couple of other affiliations in biomedical engineering and other things. So we've got a really great panel of experts, and I'm excited to get into this awesome topic. So to start off, maybe we can kind of just set the stage here of what neural technology is. Miriam, would you be okay with starting us off? Just tell us what is neurotechnology, and then what is your research specifically in neurotech?
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the introduction. It's really fun to be here today. So neurotechnology is kind of an interface with the brain. And the goal is that you would record electrical activity patterns in the brain or other potential magnetic patterns or optical pattern, any kind of modality that can measure the brain. And then you would try to use that to decode an internal state of the brain or a behavioral state, and then use that as potential means to provide therapy or treat brain disorders. So let's take an example. Let's say somebody who is paralyzed, they still can think about and plan a movement, but they can't communicate that to their muscles. So what if we can record from their brain, try to decode what movement they want to perform, and then translate that into a robotic arm movement or a cursor movement? Then we can actually restore function in that paralyzed patients. So that is what neurotechnology is, that interface with the brain that allows us to decode and interpret brain signals. And originally, when the field started about 20 years ago, the focus was on movements. How do we decode movements for the obvious purpose of restoring function in paralyzed patients? We've come quite a long way since then. We have companies like Synchron that are commercializing these products. But recently, we've also been thinking about brain-computer interfaces for a new generation of applications. For example, for mental health conditions. Can we also think about decoding emotions and moods? And if we can do that, let's say in somebody who has major depression, then guide them as to the mode of therapy or whether they should see their physician. So you can think of neurotechnologies as these interfaces with the brain that try to infer internal and behavioral states to do something good for the patient as potentially alternative therapies.
Thank you. Yeah, and so Tom, can you just tell us a bit about Synchron and maybe answer the same question? What is neurotech, but then from your perspective, from the commercialization side?
Yeah, so hi everyone, Tom, CEO of Synchron. I'm a neurologist by training, and I'd heard about, went into neurology in medicine. It's an interesting area of medicine, very interesting. Often the joke from other surgeons who are saying that, well, you can diagnose everything in the brain, but you can't treat anything. So I think in medicine has traditionally been a field that you can't do much about, and yet with as much as a mortality, morbidity burden as, say, cardiac. So one of the biggest causes of health burden that we can't do much about. So neurotechnology is health and consumer technologies that interface with the brain or the nervous system. And I'd categorize them into, I guess, there's brain-computer interface that's implantable and not implantable. There are medical applications, there are consumer applications. Traditionally in medical implants, there have been implants that stimulate, deep brain stimulation, cochlear devices for hearing. And now this new wave are sensors going into the brain that do more read. So that's a read-write analogy. So we're one of a group of companies, you've probably heard of Neuralink, Elon Musk's company. We're one of about 6 or 7 now that are building an implantable brain-computer interface. Been around for 30 years, but none have made it to market, and that's because it's very complicated technology. Needs to go into the brain, it needs to give a steady amount of information out, it needs to be safe, it needs to work for a lifetime, and then it needs to interface with products that are useful. Mariam mentioned paralysis. The field started out controlling robotic limbs, but there was really no market for that. Now the field is looking to take input from the brain, decode it, and then control things that are widely available that we all get used to that can improve your ability to live independently, and that's really smartphone control. That's where the field is starting. So we have a device. We're the only company that doesn't have to crack open the skull to get into the brain. So we build technology that's delivered through the blood vessel, which can record information without having to penetrate that blood-brain barrier. So it kind of looks like a pacemaker, but goes up into the brain, and it's meant to control an iPhone for people whose arms don't work.
Yeah. Awesome. And Peter, can you just tell me a little bit about how does Synchron leverage AI? Maybe, in the, behind the scenes, and then also how the patient is interacting with their interface.
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me here. The way Synchron leverages AI, first of all, it's in the neural decoding side. So obviously I'm grossly simplifying this, but at the end of the day, we really want to model what your brain is doing in terms of what the patient's intending to output in terms of behavior. So machine learning and the latest advances in deep learning and AI are one of the many tools that we utilize to tackle this problem. So obviously Miriam's Lab's also very familiar with this, and that's the primary way that we leverage AI. But also, we are trying to commercialize this technology. BCI has been demonstrated for decades now. We know we can decode these behavioral intentions directly from the brain. So I think the Spotify VP was talking about tokenizing various things. So if you can think about snippets of brain activity to be a token, then we can predict the next thing to think, this patient is trying to move his right hand, forward or left or to a diagonal direction. That's all well, but how do you now make it useful at the end of it as a commercial product? And I say commercial because that's the best way to actually disseminate this very useful technology to people who need it, totally paralyzed patients and people suffering from paresis. So in that end interface, we can now utilize all these AI tools that effectively reduce complex choices down. So it reduces that high dimension of your desktop interface into something that might be just a few choices. So now if you mix that as well as simple and robust behavioral output that the patient can directly output from the brain, then now the experience gets a lot easier. And even if you're totally paralyzed or have lots of motor difficulties and have other problems going, being able to interface with your digital realm becomes a lot simpler. So those are the way that we're thinking about leveraging AI in various places, trying to really commercialize this technology.
Yeah, Miriam, can you talk a little about that? I mean, are you using off-the-shelf AI tools in your lab, or are you kind of starting from scratch, building up? How do you use AI in your research?
Yeah, so we also use AI primarily to kind of model these very complex brain activity pattern and try to infer some hidden information. Now, unfortunately, we cannot use off-the-shelf AI tools because the challenges related to the brain and brain signals and brain data are very distinct. So if you think about it, brain signals are these time series data. They're not as structured as language. There's a lot of heterogeneity from one subject to the next. The recording modalities are distinct. There's a lot of complexity and noise. So the question is, how do we develop AI architectures that can model these distinct, multimodal, heterogeneous brain signals and infer some hidden information from them. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is the sparsity of brain data, right? Unlike ChatGPT or large language model that had the entire internet to train on, we don't have that much data. We don't have an internet of brain data. So can we develop architectures that can be trainable with the amount of data that we have? Finally, we want to build closed loop systems that run in real time. And we have to take into account that whatever we develop, that inference algorithm needs to be able to run in real time in an implantable device. So that also imposes constraints on our compute architectures and inference architecture and training costs. So we have to take all of this into account. And therefore, while we can, of course, take advantage of some of the conceptual advances in large language models, we can't really use them off the shelf. We have to develop architectures that are for these challenges related to building brain-computer interfaces and innovate also on the AI front.
You're nodding your head a lot, Peter. What kind of things were you thinking about when she was discussing this?
I mean, all of those things that Miriam just mentioned are the difficulties of commercializing this technology. So, you and I are all different. I hope you can see that. And even myself this morning before I had a coffee versus after, that all changes your brain states. But the whole thing is now we're at a really exciting stage where we can have these devices inside of patients chronically, and therefore now we're collecting this really rich set of data, really for the first time in history. So we're at this really interesting precipice of this new AI technology coming, but also now we are starting to being able to collect this large sets of data from various contexts. So that's really exciting. So I hope it excites future AI scientists and engineers, because now there's a new set of data that's going to start building from now on, and it didn't really exist before.
So we've got 10 people that implant now. Our longest is 5 years, I think.
Close.
So Mariam just mentioned building architecture with a small data set in order to be able to train. So we're now getting ready for the next we're scaling our clinical trial as we go. So how have you prepared?
Is this
this is your performance?
It's a performance review.
How have you prepared your architecture with regard to what Mariam just said about training using the data set that we have preparing for the next set of patients?
Yeah, I mean, I think first thing to do is trying to be a really good scientist. So this is experimental preparation. I'm trying to treat this, even in a commercial setting, as trying to run a really good, tightly controlled study. And in doing so, we're building a lot of infrastructure in-house to be able to curate this data set as well for BCI specifically. So we're not trying to, do a quick thing where leveraging some other tools. We're trying to really build purpose-built tools to build this data set well from the start. And of course, we're at the very beginning stages, but that's how we're preparing, so that once we start to curate this data set and the floodgates, so to speak, breaks, then we're ready to really take advantage of this brand new data set for the first time. And of course, a lot of things we think about is bio data. So you have to be careful about how you collect and store and be good custodians of the data too.
And Miriam, can you talk a little bit about, you've kind of pivoted in the BCI space. You did still do motor research, but then you're also moving into this new space. I mean, can you kind of pull apart the differences in how you use AI or even just algorithms in general in these two lines of research?
Yeah, so again, for those in the audience who are not as much into this domain, so if you think about a BCI for motor, the idea is you would decode unintended movement and translate that to the movement of, let's say, a computer cursor or some computer interface. Really, if you think about who is controlling that cursor, it's the person themselves, right? It's the brain that is acting as the controller of that movement. When you think about regulating an abnormal state of the brain, let's say a depression severity symptom, really the question is a little bit distinct. You want to decode, for example, the symptom state at this time, but you want to go beyond that and actually regulate and change that symptom state so that you can help the patient feel better. So the distinction is essentially you have, again, a closed loop system, but you want the regulation in addition to the decoding to happen on brain signals. So there's a lot of interesting intersection between now control theory, another branch in engineering, as well as AI. How do we develop AI algorithms that can not only infer, let's say, an emotional state, but also go beyond that and regulate that state? So that's really the idea. Decode mental states and then regulate them when somebody, for example, is depressed. So that's kind of the distinction from the modeling perspective.
What mental states have you decoded?
So we've decoded a mood state. So far, we've shown for the first time that we can actually decode mood from human intracranial brain activity. And when I say mood, the operational meaning of that is a state that's related to both depression and anxiety symptoms. And we then look at different subscales. So anxiety alone, depression alone, we can also decode those subscales of mood. So now you can extend that. You can say, okay, can I, in the case of, say, obsessive compulsive disorder, can I decode obsessions and compulsions from brain activity? In the case of addiction, can I decode the craving level from the brain such that I can intervene? I can tell the patient, hey, go see your, physician, or give them, take your pill right now. So that's the idea. They're very distinct mental states, but what they're all kind of sometimes comorbid even in some of these psychiatric disorders. And those are the ones that we try to decode.
Are you presenting the patient? So you've got a closed loop deep brain stimulation. You're looking for features, and then that modulates how the stimulation comes in, which is meant to impact the mood. Have you presented to the patients your version of their mood to them rather than separate to the delivery of the therapy? And has that had an impact?
No, we have not done that. So what we try to do so far is to try to just track their naturalistic variations in their mood states. We don't try to induce it. We don't try to, involve them in a task that changes that, because the brain networks and the brain representations for naturalistic variations may potentially be distinct than induced states. So like watching a sad movie is very different than having depression, right? So you want to really track those clinical symptom states so that you can intervene correctly at that.
Do you track what movies they're watching?
No, I don't.
So how do you solve the contextual piece of it?
Yes. So very early days, right? So, I mean, if motor BCI started 30 years ago, we're like within 5 years of starting. But at this point, what we are doing is we are tracking their mood states within a 10-day period when they're in the hospital. So the context doesn't really change much. But let's say down the road, when they're in their at-home environment, there's of course going to be contextual changes. So the idea is that then you would be able to also record data during those context changes. And perhaps that latent representation of your deep learning architecture has as part of it the context also encoded. And therefore, it can figure out not only the state, but also the context such that it can better capture the mental state at that time.
It's exciting, really exciting stuff. And I'm curious to know, when you think about the future of neurotech, when you think about the future of Synchron, or just in general the field, where do you see it headed, and what role do you see AI playing? Tom, maybe you can take that.
So right now, the first incarnation of what the FDA is calling implantable brain-computer interface is focused on motor system. So the motor system is the control of movement, but you can decode the control of movement without moving, because you can either be paralyzed or you can intend to move. So there's a whole control system up here that is completely separate to what gets expressed. So the idea is, if you can have a reliable measure of motor intention, you can convert that into a digital system that can enable you to engage in a digital system. So that's the first incarnation. You might have seen Eddie Chang's lab in UCSF has done there's been a lot of talk of speech decoding, but they're not decoding the content of speech. They're decoding the way that the motor system controls the vocal cords to create phonemes. So it's actually a decoding of the attempted vocalization of speech. So it's still, even though it's being called speech, it's all still in the domain of motor decoding. And so the concept of motor decoding for phonemes is super interesting. I think that's going to be a great space. I'm not sure how big the market is for it, but we think that the market, the huge need for people who are paralyzed is an ability to live independently. So 3 million people in the US, maybe I think we think there's about 12 million globally who have some medical condition, can't move their body. It might be a stroke, ALS, muscular dystrophy, multiple sclerosis, arthropathy, muscle disease, a whole range of conditions where your brain's working, can't move your body. If you can enable them to control a digital ecosystem in a way that stops them going to a care facility, stops having a caregiver, stops really having anyone else in the room so they can get their privacy and autonomy back, that's the huge need. And I think there's huge capacity for this technology to help people become more autonomous. Right now, in the early stages, so Neuralink are removing a bit of bone, so are Paradromics, Precision are doing a smaller cut, cutting a bit of bone. We're all getting a little slither of the motor cortex. And Pete and I think that the growth over time is going to be, the growth of BCI over time is going to be the ability of companies to build technology that scales to more and more regions of brain in a way which doesn't disturb or damage brain. That's going to be the improvement of the, I don't know, you can speak to the tokenization, but how we improve our models is by getting access to more and more unique brain data and then building these foundation models that enable motor inference that enables you to now control systems. So, we're building Bluetooth controls, but, Steve Jobs hated the big iPhone because he thought your hand should be able to reach any part of the phone. And so when the big iPhone came out, he hated that because he's like, well, you have to use two hands to control it now. The point I'm making is that all of the technology we use is built around the limitations of our physical manifestation of our bodies. So I think BCI is going to break through that over time because we're not going to have that constraint of what are the constraints of your physical physical body. And so, so that's going to be like phase one is motor. And then eventually, I think that gets to from small device control to three-dimensional control, robotics control, entire world control, total recall. You're walking around and there's a screen everywhere and you're able to engage with things without touching anything. But then I think what Mariam's doing, for everyone in the audience, Mariam is world leading person as academic scientist in decoding emotional states from brain implants. And I think that's going to be the second wave. And I asked that question, like, are you showing the patients? Because I'm still grappling my evenings with the ethics of decoding emotional states, because I don't know what you do with that information in a way that's, it raises a whole bunch of ethical questions that we have to deal with. But I'm crapping on here, but I'm going to say I think what will come in that wave is the limitation of our ability as humans to connect with each other in an emotional way and in a communication way. We're good at using words. Words don't really capture what we're saying. I think that BCI is going to enable a level of human communication that is not possible with our bodies.
And also from a clinical perspective, right? I completely agree. The first phase is going to be motor, and there's a huge need for that, as Tom mentioned. But if you think about psychiatric disorders, the number of patients who are impacted, order of magnitude larger. It's a huge societal burden, leading cause of disability worldwide. So anything that we can do would be of huge impact for these patients. And if you think about the ethical implications, there's a lot of neuroethicists who are actually thinking about this. But if you think about 20% of major depression patients who have essentially no options, no drug works, therapy doesn't work, they're at risk of suicide, I would argue it would be unethical for us not to do anything. And there are very smart people thinking about the neuroethics of this. Similar thing for speech BCIs, right? So people have shown that you can decode silent speech when somebody is just thinking about saying something, they can also decode that. And that raised a whole set of ethical questions as well. So it's not limited to emotions, but all kind of neurotechnologies and BCIs. And I think it's imperative on all of us and on neuroethicists to really think deeply about the ethical implications and solutions for that while we push the technology forward to help these tens of millions of patients.
Yeah. And what you're mentioning too is also it relies upon someone having the implant in the brain too, right? Right.
And this is at this point, frankly, for the most severe cases when there's really no other option. Drug has failed, therapy has failed, or in the case of paralysis, like they really have no remaining movement or EMG that can be utilized. That's the kind of BCIs that Tom and us and the field is building. So this is really for very severe cases where there are really no alternatives. And the hope is that this would improve the quality of life for these people as alternative and potentially revolutionizing therapies.
Yeah, and Peter, I want to go back a little bit to when we were talking about building AI tools to help with, preparing for the next patient, right? You've done 10, is that right? We've got
10 so far.
10 patients so far. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm for building AI tools that are useful to certain industries. Maybe not people that are necessarily in the industry, but want to be, useful for certain things. I mean, are there any gaps that you've noticed that would be really useful tools in your work?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to speak in hypotheticals here. So there are a couple ways that we can tackle this problem. One is that, we collect lots of data, do the traditional machine learning. We are able to model the brain well enough, and that generalizes across people or the different patients, different hours. That's one way. So far, how BCI has been working is you have a very dedicated PhD student or a postdoc working really personally with the patient. So they almost like have a PT. And Miriam, you and I were talking yesterday at dinner, or maybe it was at backstage today. It takes special skills, not just scientific and engineering prowess, but also that bedside manner and how the patient is taking in the experiments and what the brain state looks like. So another alternative way is, can AI help to kind of do that training, right? So we'll see whether both are required, or I hope the first one works just well enough because that's a much simpler solution. But in another world, these increasingly intelligent tools could perhaps help in these personalization, right? So we talked about the Spotify before. That was really interesting. It's a single company, single brand, but very well customized across all the different individuals. So I can kind of see something like that happening if it turns out that after decades of research that human brain, it are really individualized at that level, or maybe we're struggling with really finding the latent space that represents everyone. Because we're talking about what do you think about the future of neurotech and BCI is, if I talk in 5 to 10 years time, I'm hoping that we can create a synthetic virtual nervous system. So this is part of your body. It should be near your body, whether it's a wearable or implantable. Your algorithm should be running kind of with you and not somewhere remotely. So now in this sense, how do you retrain these models, and who does it? So I think in that sense, the AI tools come in really handy because you're kind of working with your PT to make your stuff better, make your body better. And that's why Tom and I always insist that this is on your prosthetic. It's not an assistive device. We're trying to restore function of the body. So that's how I think about it.
What do you think about a virtual nervous system?
Virtual nervous system. That's
Each just dropped.
I mean, it's a fancy term.
It's cool. I mean, the way I think about the virtual nervous system is essentially a foundation model for the brain. So, I mean, as you probably this audience knows, we have foundation models for language, right? What if we can actually build one, put all of our data together from different modalities, whether it's electrical activity, magnetic, optical imaging, put it all together to come up with a foundation model of the brain that then we can use downstream to replicate various functions that somebody has, whether it's movement, whether it's their emotion, but any kind of action they have. So to me, that is kind of a virtual nervous system where you have modeled the entire brain, and then you can figure out the mechanisms and then use it to enhance or restore function.
Is that what Reid Hoffman did this morning?
I don't think at the level of the nervous system, at the level of behavior. Right. That's interesting. Well, and one of the things we talked about before that's a little bit tricky about neural tech is just the fact that there isn't as much data as we have as like large language models. We can't just go scrape, the internet, and then we have all of this data that we can build off of. We're using very select, finite amounts of data and very precious data that, each patient, each thing. So as we get more and more data, through new companies, through new efforts, just through longer patients, what does that open up for you in the future? Like, what do you do with all that extra data?
So, the dream is that you would combine all that data and train a deep learning architecture that can actually generalize from person to person. And perhaps there's some fine tuning needed, but overall the model would generalize. And that would really, from an individualization point of view, there's always going to be heterogeneity, but perhaps there's also a lot of biological commonality. And if you put all the data together and come up with a foundation model, we have already captured the commonality. And then if you want to just personalize the model to an individual patient, we just need a little bit of fine tuning, but we don't start from scratch. So I think there's a lot of excitement that we can find these shared latent representation across modalities of measurement from the brain to come up with foundation models, and these latents, each set of them would relate to a given function, and we can get it downstream.
How close are we to that? It's hard to put a number.
We're not there, but we are not too far.
Okay.
I think we are maybe like to the first really foundation model, maybe 5 years away.
5 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we built one. I think the productization of that is out of the box. It's got to work straight away. Now, maybe the feature set is not as sophisticated as what it could be, but why don't you speak to that? Because you've gone through that journey of to be successful commercially. Sure. It's got to scale, and we can't have a neuroscientist in each person's home.
Right.
So how have you solved that? Where are we up to with that?
So, of course, we want this technology to work at mass for all of our patients, and you don't want to spend hundreds of hours to make it work. And I think, to Miriam, when we say foundational model, I think you could also, it varies in terms of how much dimension are you trying to represent. So one thing we can do is reduce the problem, to be simpler for our own benefit, at the benefit so that the patient can use stuff straight out of the box. So something like general motor intention. So it doesn't matter if you're trying to move your hand or a foot or whatever. We've built a much simpler version of the model that you can just detect that, right? So even if the patient tried to move their hand or the right hand, doesn't matter if it was patient 1 or patient 2, we can at least very simply detect that onset or offset. So, but then, of course, once we want to get to the stage of trying to decode the entire body, so the output that comes out of our model versus a motion capture suit being equal is kind of the future that I dream of. But of course, capturing that foundational model will be a lot more difficult. But we're trying to get there.
And we started we're setting navigate and click as the minimal viable performance of the interaction method that's the output from those motor intents. So you've got to be able to choose a area on the screen and select it as a minimum use case. But we also come to realize you have to turn the thing on. So we all take that for granted. You swipe it, it looks at your face, it unlocks it, or you put your passcode in. That's, our users can't do that. So we're now having to generate these variable signatures out of the model that enable the user to wake up, turn on the system, activate an app, choose what they want to do, navigate and select, make some options, and then shut it again. So all these different, models that you're using have these different outputs that serve these basic things that we all take for granted.
Yeah, I think these are the things that become apparent when you're trying to commercialize a thing. So, we all remember butt dialing, sitting on your phone and calling someone and you're talking and that's not what you want. And something like the neural interface is, it's recording all the time if you think about it. It's just electricity conducting through. And then if it's connected to your phone, you don't want it to make, bunch of butt dial. So trying to think about this, we're really thinking about the actual commercial applications. How will the user actually use it? And it's an interesting space to be in BCI at this time, because traditionally you don't really think about, well, at least in academia, we didn't think about it that way. You're in a control setting, you run experiments, you track their bit rate and see how well they go. And home use, obviously a lot. There's really excellent groups thinking about these, obviously BrainGate, Ramsey Lab, they're all thinking about at home use, but at a commercial scale, it's supposed to work for everyone. So how can we make a simple, robust solutions that's going to work for everyone is a challenging thing.
I think one dream would be that we, at the end of the day, at the end of 5 years or however long it takes, we'll really have a multimodal AI model that it doesn't matter whether you have the Synchron device or you have, I don't know, some Utah array recordings, or you have magnetic recording or optical recording. You can really use the same model, the multimodal model, to extract those latent representations. And those latent representations would not only give you movement, but give you emotions or give you thoughts or any kind of state you're interested in. We are very far from there. But once we have enough data and we think about these architectures carefully, perhaps we can go towards those multimodal models, just like text and images that we can already do here for NLP applications.
Yeah. So I'm looking through some of the questions that we've submitted. We've just got a minute left. And there are a few questions about ethical concerns. And I'm curious to know, what do you say to somebody who's worried about the intersection of, AI and neurotechnology, given that it is an invasive medical device? Tom, do you want to take that?
Yeah, it's really important. I think there's a UNESCO development, there's a World Economic Forum development, there's a WHO, there's a lot of global bodies that are now thinking through neuroethics. In my head, it's divided in this dichotomy of, on the one hand, privacy concerns, and on the other hand, a requirement for extended autonomy. So it's privacy and autonomy moving between the two. I think what happened with Facebook and what we've learned with Google is that data sharing, third parties, that's a breach. If that happened in BCI, it's not going to be acceptable. So I think there's going to be a question around how data is shared that gives consideration to protecting privacy but extending autonomy, and it's going to be hard.
Great. Okay, well, we are right out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. So thank you all.
Thank you.